A guest mocked the Black Maid for mispronouncing a name, until the Mafia Boss repeated it her way. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Aaliyah Brooks. The crystal chandeliers glowed above her like distant stars as she stepped into the grand ballroom, her apron neatly pressed, her hands steady from years of work that demanded perfection. But tonight, even she felt the weight of 100 eyes shimmering through the candlelit haze. They weren't watching her yet, not until the mistake, not until the moment that would carve itself into the silence of the room. Aaliyah moved gracefully between marble pillars, careful not to brush against the guests' tailored suits and glittering gowns. She whispered the name on the place card to herself again, trying to soften the syllable she'd practiced all afternoon. She believed she had it right. She hoped she had it right. But hope doesn't always hold when the air is thick with judgment. Caroline Mercer's laugh drifted across the ballroom even before Aaliyah reached her table, sharp, sculpted, the kind of laugh that knew it belonged to old money. Aaliyah set the glass down gently beside her, lifted her chin just enough to be polite, and offered the greeting she'd memorized. Then she said the guest's name. One syllable landed slightly off. Not wrong, just shaped by her accent, softened by the warm cadences she grew up with in Georgia. It was barely noticeable, hardly a mistake, but in certain rooms, the smallest slip becomes an invitation to cruelty. Caroline froze mid-breath. Then her painted smile widened into something thinner, colder. "I'm sorry," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Could you say that again?" But slower this time. Much slower. A few guests turned. Aaliyah's chest tightened, but she repeated the name, shaping it carefully. It still carried the music of her roots. Caroline blinked dramatically. "Oh dear," she said, her voice syrupy and cruel. "Is English not your first language?" Soft chuckles rippled through the crowd. Aaliyah felt her spine stiffen, the humiliation settling like a stone beneath her ribs. She wished the floor would open beneath her feet, but she stood firm because dignity was all she had in this place. What she could not see, was Dominic Veretti at the head of the room, his expression unreadable under the chandelier glow as he watched everything. His hand stilled around his glass. His gaze sharpened like a quiet storm forming behind his eyes. And though the room continued to hum with laughter, a hush began to gather around him, subtle as a shift in the wind, signaling that the night was about to change in ways no one expected. Caroline's laughter still lingered in the air, a brittle sound that clung to the edges of the ballroom like static. Aaliyah kept her gaze lowered, willing her hands not to shake as she folded the linen napkin on the table's edge. She knew she should step back, apologize again, fade into the background the way she had been trained to do since her very first day in service. But humiliation has a way of slowing time, turning every second into something sharp. The guests nearby pretended not to stare, yet their eyes followed her, curious, entertained, waiting for the next stumble. Aaliyah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the same one she used to feel in elementary school when teachers corrected her pronunciation in front of the class. She had been 8 years old then, small and eager, just wanting to sound right. Now she was 26, standing beneath chandeliers worth more than her yearly income, and the feeling had returned as if no time had passed at all. She forced herself to take a steady breath. She reminded herself why she endured nights like this. Rent was due next week. Her mother's medical appointments were piling up. She needed every hour of overtime she could get. She needed this job, even if moments like these chipped away at pieces of her she wished she could hold on to. Caroline tilted her head, inspecting her as if she were a misplaced decoration. "My goodness," she said, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the attention of the nearest tables. "I suppose certain sounds are more difficult for certain people. Do not worry. Maybe one day you will get it right." The words floated out smoothly, wrapped in false sweetness. Aaliyah swallowed hard. She wanted to answer, to defend herself, but she knew that responding would only feed the spectacle. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes the only shield she had. She stepped back with quiet dignity, her face composed even as her heartbeat felt uneven beneath her uniform. What she did not see was the subtle shift happening across the room. Dominic Veretti had not moved, not even a fraction, but his attention had narrowed. His fingers rested lightly on the stem of his glass, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Aaliyah, studying the way she held herself in the storm of someone else's amusement. Those who knew him well understood that he did not raise his voice when something disturbed him. He did not gesture or posture or demand immediate obedience. His disapproval arrived the way winter did, quiet at first, then undeniable. A guest leaned toward Caroline, whispering something that made her grin widen. She seemed pleased with the audience forming around her, pleased to be the center of a joke that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with hierarchy. Aaliyah turned away, giving a small nod as if excusing herself, and headed toward the server's station with carefully measured steps, the kind that made it seem like she was not escaping but merely returning to duty. Her throat felt tight, but her spine stayed straight. The polished floor reflected her outline back at her, reminding her that even shadows had to stand somewhere. Yet as she reached for a fresh tray, she sensed something behind her shift, like the subtle dip in temperature before a door opens. Dominic Veretti had risen from his chair. He did not make an announcement. He did not call attention to himself, but the murmurs in the room softened instinctively, as if the air itself recognized who now held it. Aaliyah did not turn. She did not dare. But deep inside, something told her that the moment she had hoped to survive quietly was no longer hers alone to carry. In the quiet that followed Dominic's rise, Aaliyah steadied herself behind the server's station, pretending to arrange silverware that did not actually need arranging. Her fingers traced the polished handles, the cool metal grounding her as she swallowed back the sting in her throat. She reminded herself that dignity was not something anyone could take unless she handed it over, but some nights that reminder felt heavier than others. The ballroom lights shimmered against the white tablecloths, casting soft reflections that blurred slightly as she blinked away the moisture gathering at the edges of her eyes. She kept her back turned, hoping the moment of humiliation would fade into the noise of the evening. But something in the air told her the night was shifting around her, rearranging itself in ways she could not yet understand. She reached for a folded napkin, smoothing it between her palms, but her mind drifted back to the earliest lesson she had learned about speaking aloud. Her grandmother's gentle voice echoed in memory, encouraging her to read stories out loud on the porch, telling her that her voice carried warmth, that it was a gift. Aaliyah had believed that once. She wondered when she stopped. Maybe when her third-grade teacher insisted she repeat a sentence 5 times in front of the class. Maybe when a store clerk in Atlanta pretended not to understand her until she changed her tone. Or maybe tonight, when a room full of strangers found amusement in something she never meant to be funny. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, willing her heartbeat to return to something steady. Just make it through the night, she told herself. One more shift, one more paycheck, one more promise kept to her mother. Behind her, the low hum of conversation softened again, almost imperceptible, as if the atmosphere bent around a single presence. Dominic Veretti did not walk quickly, but he did not need to. His footsteps held a deliberate calm, the kind that made space for itself simply by existing. He paused near Caroline's table, though he did not address her. Instead, he looked toward the server's station where Aaliyah stood, her shoulders slightly drawn inward like someone bracing against wind. Aaliyah felt the faintest shift of air and knew someone was behind her. She drew a slow breath before turning, carefully keeping her expression neutral. When her eyes met Dominic's, her breath caught for a reason she could not name. His expression was unreadable, his posture composed, but there was something in the stillness of his gaze that made it impossible to look away. She expected reprimand. She expected disappointment. She expected to be told, to be more careful, to apologize more gracefully, to remember that guests must never feel uncomfortable. Instead, he spoke her name with a quiet steadiness that softened the edges of the room. Aaliyah, he said, as though it were the only word he needed. Her pulse fluttered at the sound. Few people in this place said her name. Fewer still said it with any sense of recognition. She clasped her hands together, the napkin still folded neatly between her fingers. Yes, sir. His gaze lowered briefly, not in judgment, but as if acknowledging the effort it took for her to hold herself upright. When he looked back at her, there was a depth in his eyes she had not seen before, something contemplative, something measuring the invisible weight she carried. And in that moment, standing in the glow of a ballroom where she had been treated as little more than entertainment, she realized that the night's quiet turning point had arrived, and nothing felt quite the same. For a moment neither of them spoke, the soft hum of the ballroom wrapping around them like a veil. Aaliyah held the folded napkin carefully, as if the thin piece of fabric was the only thing keeping her steady. Dominic's gaze remained on her, calm and measured, carrying a quiet gravity that made the edges of the room blur. She lifted her chin just slightly, enough to show respect but not submission, and waited for him to speak again. When he did, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "You did nothing wrong." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that made her breath catch. People rarely defended her, especially not people like him, people whose names carried influence as effortlessly as they carried their tailored suits. She blinked once, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Sir?" she asked softly. Dominic studied her face, the tension in her jaw, the way she held herself, so carefully composed. "I watched what happened," he said, his tone even, "and I want you to understand that the mistake was not yours." Something inside her tightened. She was not used to being seen. Not like this. Not with clarity. She lowered her eyes briefly, unsure how to hold such unexpected kindness. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, though the words felt too small for the moment. He nodded once, a gesture slow enough to feel intentional. "Return to your duties," he said gently, not as an order, but as a way to release her from the spotlight that had burned too brightly a few minutes earlier. Aaliyah stepped back, grateful for the distance, yet strangely aware of the quiet strength in his presence. She turned toward the refreshment table, but her thoughts were no longer steady. They drifted back to mornings before sunrise, when she practiced speaking names and greetings aloud before her shift. She had always believed that if she worked hard enough, she could outrun the moments that reminded her she was different in ways people never let her forget. As she lifted a tray of sparkling water glasses, she glanced briefly toward the table where Caroline sat. The woman's smile had thinned. Her posture was rigid now, her earlier confidence flickering as she watched Dominic walk away from the server's station. Aaliyah could not hear what Caroline whispered to the guest beside her, but the slight tremor in her forced laugh said enough. The balance of the evening had shifted, though no one had announced it. Aaliyah carried the tray through the ballroom, each step steady, her confidence returning piece by fragile piece. She felt eyes follow her, not with mockery this time, but with something closer to curiosity. Perhaps they sensed the subtle change in the room's rhythm, a quiet awareness that the story they had expected to unfold was no longer the one they were witnessing. Near the grand piano, she paused to refill glasses. The polished wood reflected her silhouette back at her, and for the first time since the incident, she could look at her reflection without flinching. She had endured. She had not broken. And though she did not fully understand what Dominic intended, she sensed that the night was not finished reshaping itself. Something unspoken was gathering, something that would return every gaze in the ballroom to the moment everyone had tried to brush aside. And in the center of that moment stood Aaliyah, holding her dignity the way she held her tray, carefully, deliberately, unwilling to let it fall again. Dominic paused near the center of the ballroom, the warm glow of the chandeliers softening the lines of his expression as he glanced toward Caroline's table. Conversations had resumed, but in a quieter, more cautious rhythm, as if everyone sensed that the evening balanced on a delicate thread. Aaliyah moved through the room with renewed steadiness, unaware that the moment she tried so hard to shrink away from was exactly the moment Dominic could not ignore. He watched her lift a tray with careful grace, her posture tall again, though not untouched by what had happened. There was something dignified in the way she reclaimed her space, something that contrasted sharply with Caroline's forced smile and the restless shifting of her shoulders. Aaliyah reached another table, offering drinks with a polite smile, and for a heartbeat, Dominic noticed how her voice softened each greeting, carrying a warmth that did not belong to the cold marble columns or the meticulously arranged centerpieces. It belonged to someone who worked hard, someone who cared, someone who deserved better than a careless insult tossed across linen tablecloths. Caroline adjusted her jewelry dramatically, trying to recapture attention from the guests who had already begun drifting away from her orbit. Her companion leaned in to speak, but she swatted the comment aside, her eyes fixed on Dominic with a mixture of confusion and irritation. She had expected him to laugh with her, to indulge her theatrics, not to disrupt them with silence that felt heavier than any reprimand. Near the server's station, Aaliyah placed the tray down and exhaled quietly. She glanced across the room, her eyes passing briefly over Dominic before she looked away, careful not to linger too long. She did not want to misinterpret his earlier words. She did not want to assume anything. She simply held on to the one moment of grace he had offered, letting it settle inside her like a small light in a dim place. Dominic began to walk again, but his attention shifted as he noticed an older couple approach Aaliyah. The woman offered a kind smile, asking for a refill, while the man complimented her professionalism. Their voices were gentle, without mockery. Aaliyah nodded gratefully, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. The sight stirred something in Dominic. Respect, he believed, should never be rare. A guest nearby commented under their breath about tonight's entertainment, and though the words were not loud, they reached Dominic's ears. His stride slowed. Something cool, focused, and very still settled behind his eyes. Yet he kept his composure, the same controlled calm that made his presence felt without ever needing to be announced. Aaliyah retrieved a crystal pitcher from the refreshment table, her reflections shimmering across the polished surface. She moved with a renewed determination, but inside she knew the sting of humiliation would echo long after the laughter had faded. Still, she pushed forward, because that was what she had always done. Behind her, the music shifted to a softer melody, and she allowed herself a small breath of relief. But that relief was brief. As she turned with the pitcher in hand, Dominic stepped into her path, not abruptly, but with careful intention, as though he wanted her to know she was not alone in the memory of what had happened. When she lifted her eyes to his, she saw not pity, not judgment, but a quiet understanding that made her heartbeat flutter with something unfamiliar. And though he had said little, his presence alone told her that the night was not finished speaking for her, even if she had tried to stay silent. The moment stretched between them, quiet and steady, as if the entire ballroom paused to listen for what would happen next. Aaliyah shifted the crystal pitcher in her hands, unsure whether to step aside or meet Dominic's gaze fully. His presence did not crowd her, but it carried a certainty that reached her before his words did. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "May I see your card?" She blinked, confused for a heartbeat, until she remembered the small set of guest name cards she had been arranging earlier. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the card belonging to the table she had been serving. Her fingers brushed the edge lightly before offering it to him. Dominic accepted it with a measured nod, turning it over once between his fingers. He glanced toward Caroline's table, then back at the card, as though examining something far more important than a decorative script. "Say the name for me," he said calmly. The request made her breath falter, not because it was unreasonable, but because it brought her back to the moment she wanted to forget. She hesitated only a second before speaking. She pronounced the name exactly as she had earlier, her voice soft but clear, shaped by the accent she carried like a quiet inheritance. Dominic listened without interrupting. Then, unexpectedly, he repeated the name. He repeated it, precisely as she had said it, matching her cadence, her vowels, even the gentle rise at the end that belonged to her. The sound settled between them, simple and unmistakable. Aaliyah stared at him, stunned that he would mimic her pronunciation so deliberately, so respectfully. Before she could react, Dominic turned and walked toward the center of the room, still holding the card. Aaliyah felt something shift inside her, a warmth, a confusion, a disbelief that someone of his stature would echo her voice instead of correcting it. Caroline noticed Dominic approaching and straightened immediately, smoothing her dress as if preparing for applause. "Dominic," she said brightly, "I hope everything is to your liking." Her tone carried the confidence of someone who assumed the world revolved around her comfort. Dominic held the card lightly between his fingers and spoke in a conversational tone, but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I want to ensure the pronunciation for this name is correct tonight." He looked directly at Caroline, then repeated the name again exactly as Aaliyah had said it. The room softened into a hush. A few guests glanced at one another, unsure if they had heard correctly. Caroline's smile stiffened. "Well," she said with a strained laugh, "that is unconventional." Dominic tilted his head slightly, his expression calm and unbothered. "It is correct," he replied, "and we respect accuracy here." The statement was quiet, polite, and unmistakably final. It was not a rebuke delivered with force. It was a correction delivered with certainty. Aaliyah stood frozen near the refreshment table, her heart thudding in her chest as she realized what had just happened. He had not defended her outright. He had not scolded anyone. Instead, he had taken her voice and placed it at the center of the room, steadying it with his own. And just like that, the laughter from earlier evaporated, replaced by a silence that tasted like something close to justice. The silence that followed Dominic's words settled over the ballroom like a soft curtain, shifting the atmosphere in a way every guest could feel but none dared to name. Caroline stood frozen, her practiced smile trembling at the edges as she looked around, searching for someone to validate her discomfort. No one moved. No one agreed. The same crowd that had laughed moments earlier now seemed unsure, caught between the echo of their own amusement and the quiet authority that had replaced it. Dominic offered a polite nod to a nearby couple, as though the exchange had been nothing more than clarification. Yet every person who watched understood the message beneath his calm tone. Aaliyah's pronunciation was not wrong. Mocking her had been. At the refreshment table, Aaliyah struggled to find her breath. She held the crystal pitcher so tightly her knuckles pressed white against her skin, but her heartbeat pulsed with something new, something rising between disbelief and relief. To have her voice echoed, affirmed, placed gently back into the world by someone of his stature felt like a moment she had never imagined for herself. She waited until Dominic turned away from the center of the room before she set the pitcher down, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she might disrupt the fragile balance of her composure. Guests began to murmur again, but their tones had changed, softened. Some stole glances toward her that carried curiosity rather than ridicule. Others looked at Caroline with questions in their eyes, the kind that come when a person's confidence begins to crack. Caroline lifted her chin, as if trying to gather back the shards of her fading authority. "Well," she said loudly, but a slight quiver betrayed her. "I suppose everyone has their preferences." The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, choosing not to respond. Caroline noticed the absence of validation and tightened her grip on her napkin. Across the room, Dominic spoke briefly with a pair of donors, his demeanor composed, unaffected by the tension he had subtly unraveled. There was nothing harsh about his actions, nothing confrontational, yet the room aligned itself around his example with quiet precision. Respect, when demonstrated by someone who commanded it naturally, had a way of reshaping the air. Aaliyah stepped away from the table, needing movement to steady herself. She walked toward the far side of the ballroom, where the tall windows looked out over the evening skyline. The city lights shimmered like distant fires, reflecting across the glass. She paused there, letting the glow wash over her, letting the coolness of the window frame anchor her. It had been so long since anyone stood beside her in a moment of embarrassment. So long since anyone insisted that her dignity mattered as much as anyone else's. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss, may I have another sparkling water?" She turned to see the older woman from earlier, the one who had smiled kindly at her. "Of course," Aaliyah replied, her voice steadier now. The woman leaned in just slightly. "You handled yourself beautifully, dear." Aaliyah felt warmth rise in her chest, a gentle affirmation she had not expected. She nodded gratefully and walked back to the server's station to retrieve a fresh glass. As she approached, she sensed Dominic's presence again, not because he spoke, but because the air shifted with the same subtle certainty she felt earlier. He was not watching her, at least not directly, but his posture angled just enough in her direction that she knew the moment between them was not accidental. It was deliberate. And quietly, undeniably, the night was still unfolding around that single choice he had made, to repeat her voice as if it mattered. The music softened into a gentle melody that drifted around the ballroom like a calm breath after a storm. Aaliyah carried the fresh, sparkling water back toward the older woman, her steps light, but her thoughts swirling with the weight of everything that had happened. She felt as though she was moving inside a moment that did not quite belong to her, a moment too rare, too fragile to fully understand yet. She handed the glass to the woman, who thanked her warmly before returning to her conversation. Aaliyah turned, ready to continue her duties, when her gaze caught Dominic across the room. He was speaking with two guests, but something in the angle of his posture hinted that his awareness remained tethered to her presence. She quickly looked away, not wanting to assume significance where there might be none. Still, the quiet support he had offered earlier lingered in her chest like a steady glow. The night moved on in small, elegant motions. Guests drifted between tables. Laughter resumed, but it was softer now, more thoughtful. Even the chandeliers seemed to cast a gentler light, as if the room itself had taken a breath. Caroline, however, sat stiffly at her table, her eyes darting toward anyone who whispered nearby. Her earlier confidence had thinned to something brittle, almost translucent. The guests at her table murmured politely, but none leaned in with enthusiasm. Aaliyah sensed the shift each time she passed by, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had no desire to see someone humiliated. She only wished the night had not tried so hard to humiliate her. As she circled toward the grand staircase to collect used glasses, she felt footsteps approach behind her. She turned just enough to see Dominic standing there, not imposing, not demanding, simply present. He offered a slight tilt of his head, a gesture that asked for a moment of her time without pressuring her. She set the glasses down at the nearest table and stepped closer, her hands folding lightly in front of her. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. Dominic regarded her with the same steady calm he had shown all evening. "Are you all right?" The question was simple, but it landed with a depth she was not prepared for. No one had asked her that since she arrived for her shift hours earlier. The sincerity in his tone made it clear that he wanted the truth, not the automatic answer she usually gave. She hesitated. "I am managing," she said at last, carefully choosing the words that revealed enough without exposing the ache beneath them. Dominic studied her expression with quiet thoughtfulness. "You handled yourself with grace," he said. "Far more than some of my guests this evening." Her eyes widened slightly, caught between gratitude and disbelief. Compliments were rare in her line of work, especially ones spoken with such intention. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice gentle but sure. "That means a great deal." A faint shift in his expression, something like understanding or perhaps regret on her behalf, softened the seriousness in his gaze. "No one should be spoken to the way you were," he added, not raising his voice, not drawing attention, just stating a truth the world often forgot. Aaliyah felt warmth gather behind her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a feeling she could only describe as being seen. Truly seen. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than she intended, and when she finally looked away, she found it easier to breathe. Behind them, the ballroom stirred with new life, as though the night itself was beginning to settle into a gentler rhythm. But even with the evening slowly returning to its graceful flow, Aaliyah sensed that something unspoken still lingered in the air, something delicate and profound, waiting for its moment to unfold. The gentle melody drifting through the ballroom softened further, as if the night itself understood it was approaching its final, quiet truth. Aaliyah stood near the edge of the room, her hands resting lightly against the serving cart, her breath steadying as she watched the last wave of guests mingle beneath the chandelier glow. There was no trace left of the earlier laughter that had cut through her like cold glass. In its place was a thoughtful hush, a collective recalibration of tone and posture. She moved toward the tables to collect empty glasses, each step of hers light but certain, as though something inside her had rooted more firmly than before. When she reached the table where Caroline sat, the woman avoided her eyes entirely, gripping her clutch with a tightness that suggested she wished she could disappear into it. The guests beside her shifted in their seats, offering polite smiles to Aaliyah, the kind that held apology without words. Aaliyah simply nodded and continued her work, not with triumph, but with a steadiness that came from knowing she no longer needed to shrink to make others comfortable. As she turned to leave the table, a familiar awareness brushed her senses. Dominic was standing near the far column, watching the room as hosts often did, but his gaze paused on her with the same quiet clarity as before. She did not look away this time. Instead, she met his eyes directly for one calm, deliberate second. It was enough. She continued toward the server's station, placing the glassware neatly in its tray, letting her thoughts settle into a gentle rhythm. She remembered the porch back home, her grandmother's voice encouraging her to speak boldly, to let her words carry warmth. For years, she had believed that her voice was something to be softened, trimmed, hidden. Tonight reshaped that belief. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt the full weight and worth of her own sound. The final toast of the evening was announced, and the guests gathered near the center of the room. Aaliyah stepped back into the shadows along the wall, ensuring she remained out of the way while still attentive to the needs of the event. Dominic lifted his glass with a composed nod, addressing the donors and friends with a brief expression of gratitude. His words were warm but measured, woven with the elegance expected of him. Yet as he finished, he glanced toward her again, a small acknowledgement meant for no one else. Not a gesture of ownership, not a gesture of authority, simply recognition. The guests clapped politely, unaware of the silent exchange. When the applause faded, Aaliyah returned to her tasks, collecting the last of the plates and organizing the linens. She worked with a sense of peace she had not carried at the beginning of the evening. As she moved past the ballroom entrance, Dominic approached her path once more, though not directly. He paused at a respectful distance, his voice calm and low. "You did well tonight," he said. "You held your dignity when others lost theirs." Aaliyah felt her breath flutter gently, not with nervousness, but with something steadier. "I was just doing my job, sir," she replied. Dominic's expression softened, one corner of his mouth lifting in the slightest suggestion of a smile. "You were doing far more than that." She held his gaze a moment longer before giving a quiet nod. She turned back to her duties, her shoulders relaxed, her steps lighter than when the evening began. And as the ballroom lights dimmed for the night, a quiet truth lingered in the air, unmistakable and profound. In a room full of polished guests and glittering chandeliers, it was the dignity of one young woman that had shone the brightest. And that night, the world remembered what dignity looks like.